They called it worthless before they ever asked why his father kept it hidden. The day the will was read, the late afternoon light fell through the tall windows of the Caldwell family home in thin golden stripes, catching dust in the air like drifting ash. Ethan Caldwell stood near the fireplace, broad shoulders still and steady, his worn denim jacket hanging loose over a gray flannel shirt faded at the cuffs. At 40 years old, with short brown hair brushed back and silver beginning to touch his temples, he carried the quiet posture of a man who had learned to absorb disappointment without flinching. In his hands rested the object that had split the room in two, a rough, uneven rock the size of a small football, dull gray, with faint metallic streaks running across its surface like frozen lightning. His older brother let out a sharp breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Dad left you that," he said, shaking his head. "You can keep it." Their sister crossed her arms, her expression tight, her eyes already calculating the square footage of the land and the resale value of the house. The estate attorney had barely finished explaining the division of property when the word useless began drifting around the room like a cold draft. Worthless. Just a rock. Not even decorative. Ethan didn't argue. He simply ran his thumb slowly over the stone's surface, feeling the cool grit against his skin. It was heavier than it looked, nearly 30 pounds, solid and stubborn. His father had kept it in the shed behind the house for decades, wrapped once in an old canvas tarp, never displayed, never explained. When Ethan was a boy, he had asked about it only once. His father had smiled faintly and said, "Not everything valuable shines." That was all. Now the house that had held their childhood was being measured in acres and bank statements, and the only thing Ethan asked for was the rock. The silence that followed felt sharper than any raised voice. "If that thing means more to you than this family," his brother muttered, "then take it and go." Outside, the late September wind moved through the cottonwoods lining the driveway, leaves whispering against one another as if repeating words no one else could hear. Parked near the curb was Ethan's old pickup truck, paint chipped, tires worn but dependable. Inside the cab waited Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, broad-chested and alert, amber eyes tracking every movement through the windshield. The dog's ears were high, attentive, as though he sensed the shift in the air long before any human could name it. Ethan carried the stone down the front steps without looking back. The weight pressed into his forearms, steady and undeniable, grounding him more than the voices inside ever had. When he placed it gently into the truck bed, Ranger gave a low, thoughtful huff, not a growl, not a warning, just acknowledgement. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's head for a moment, feeling the warmth of living breath beneath his palm. The house behind him stood tall and familiar, yet somehow already distant. As he climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine rumbled to life with a tired but faithful hum. He didn't know where he was headed exactly, only that the road ahead felt clearer than the room he had just left. In the rearview mirror, the family home grew smaller with each passing yard, until it was nothing more than a pale shape against the fading sky. Beside him, Ranger shifted, eyes steady, as if watching something Ethan had not yet seen. And in the truck bed, beneath the dimming light of early evening, the so-called worthless rock caught a thin streak of sunset along its fractured edge and held it there for just a second longer than stone should. The road out of town narrowed as it curved along the river, the last of the daylight thinning into a quiet blue haze that softened the edges of everything it touched. Ethan drove with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the hum of the tires against asphalt steady and familiar. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, posture alert but calm, his thick silver and cream coat catching what little light remained. The dog's gaze moved between the windshield and the side mirror, as though tracking more than passing headlights, as though listening to something beneath the ordinary sounds of travel. In the truck bed, the rock shifted slightly when Ethan took a bend too quickly, a dull thud against metal that echoed faintly through the cab. He adjusted his speed, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight he carried. By the time he reached the small cabin he had rented 2 years earlier, the sky had deepened into indigo. The structure stood at the edge of a pine grove, half a mile off the county road, modest and weathered but solid. A single porch light cast a warm circle over the wooden steps. Ethan parked beside the shed and stepped out into the cool air, the scent of sap and damp earth rising around him. The silence there was different from the silence inside his family's house. This one felt honest. He lowered the tailgate and stared at the stone for a long moment. Up close, under the porch light, the surface looked almost textured with intention. Thin veins of silver ran diagonally across one side, faint but deliberate, as if something had once flowed through it and hardened in place. He slid his hands beneath it and lifted, muscles tightening under his sleeves, carrying it carefully toward the shed. Ranger followed close, nails clicking softly against the gravel, nose lowered, and moving slowly along the rock's edge as though cataloging its scent. Inside the shed, Ethan cleared a space on the workbench, brushing away sawdust with the side of his forearm. He set the rock down gently. The impact was solid but not hollow. He exhaled slowly, studying it the way he used to study terrain maps before a long patrol, searching for irregularities that others might overlook. There were small indentations along the underside, nearly symmetrical, and one narrow fracture line that cut deeper than the rest. He ran a flashlight beam across the crack, angling it until a brief flicker reflected back, not bright, not obvious, but distinct. Ranger's ears lifted at the same instant. The dog stepped closer and let out a low breath through his nose, not a growl, not alarm, but attention sharpened to a point. Ethan crouched beside him and rested a hand on the broad ridge of his neck. "You see it too," he murmured quietly, more statement than question. Ranger shifted his weight and placed one paw against the workbench, leaning forward to sniff along the fracture. For a moment, everything stilled. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Then the dog tapped the wood twice with his paw and pulled back, eyes fixed on that thin line in the stone. Ethan felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not fear, but recognition. His father had never been careless with his possessions. He had measured twice, cut once, and spoken only when words mattered. A man like that did not drag home 30 pounds of meaningless rock and guard it for decades without reason. Ethan stood and walked back into the cabin, returning with a small rubber mallet and a set of metal wedges he used for splitting firewood. He did not intend to break the stone apart recklessly. He simply wanted to test the seam. He positioned one wedge gently against the narrow fracture and tapped it once with the mallet. The sound that followed was not the dull thud of common granite. It carried a faint resonance, almost metallic, almost alive. Ranger's head snapped up. His ears stood high, and his amber eyes locked onto the stone as if something inside it had answered back. Ethan froze, listening. The shed held its breath around them. Somewhere beyond the trees, a barred owl called once into the dark. He tapped again, softer this time. A faint vibration traveled through the bench and into his palm, subtle but undeniable, like the hum of distant machinery felt through concrete. Ranger stepped back, then forward again, circling the bench with focused intensity. When he stopped, he placed his nose directly against the fracture and remained there, unmoving, as though waiting for permission from something neither of them could yet see. Ethan lowered the mallet slowly. He did not yet understand what his father had left him, but he knew this much with certainty. Whatever the world had dismissed as worthless was not empty, and whatever lay inside it had just begun to stir. The vibration lingered in Ethan's palm long after he lowered the mallet, a faint hum that seemed less like sound and more like memory pressing up through solid matter. He stood very still inside the shed, listening with the same disciplined patience he had once used when waiting for distant signals in uncertain terrain. Ranger remained planted beside the workbench, his amber eyes fixed on the fracture line as though the stone had spoken in a frequency only he could hear. The air inside the shed felt denser now, scented with pine resin and cold iron, the single overhead bulb casting a steady yellow glow that traced every ridge and vein across the rock's surface. Ethan reached forward again, this time placing his entire hand flat against the stone. It was cool, almost unnaturally so, despite the warmth of the enclosed space. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not out of superstition, but to focus. Beneath his palm, there it was again, subtle and rhythmic, not loud enough to echo, but consistent enough to deny coincidence. Ranger shifted his stance and gave one low, thoughtful huff through his nose. Then, with deliberate care, he lifted his paw and pressed it against the bench near the fracture, holding it there as if marking a location. Ethan opened his eyes and followed the dog's silent cue. The crack was no wider than the edge of a coin, but it ran deeper than he had first assumed. He angled the flashlight closer and noticed something new, something he had missed under the porch light. Along the inner edge of the fracture, just beneath the surface, there was a faint metallic sheen that did not match the dull exterior. It was not silver in the ordinary sense. It carried a warmer tone, almost like brushed steel touched by sunset. His father's voice returned to him with surprising clarity. Not everything valuable shines. Ethan swallowed slowly, the weight of that memory settling into place. His father had been a quiet man, a former mining surveyor who spent decades studying land that most people drove past without a second glance. He believed in patience, in layers, in the idea that what rested beneath often mattered more than what stood on the surface. Ethan had not understood that as a boy. Now, kneeling in a dim shed with a 30-pound stone humming faintly under his hand, he began to see the lesson in a different light. Ranger suddenly pulled back and circled once, then twice, before stopping at the far side of the bench. His ears were high, posture alert, but not anxious. He let out 3 short barks, spaced evenly, the same pattern he used when something shifted in the environment, not a threat, but a change. Ethan felt the hair along his forearms rise, not from fear, but from recognition. "All right," he said softly, his voice steady. "We do this the right way." He set the mallet aside and walked back into the cabin, returning with a thinner wedge and a small pry bar he used for precision work. He positioned the wedge carefully along the fracture and tapped it once, then again, controlled and measured. The sound that followed carried a different resonance this time, sharper, clearer, almost as if the stone had responded to the pressure by revealing its true density. A thin line spread along the crack, not explosive, not dramatic, but decisive. Ethan paused, allowing the tension to settle before applying more force. Ranger leaned forward, muscles coiled with focused anticipation, tail held level behind him. Another careful tap, and the fracture widened just enough for Ethan to slide the pry bar into place. He applied steady pressure, not forcing, simply encouraging what was already there to open. The rock shifted with a muted grind, and a narrow seam revealed itself, exposing something smooth and metallic beneath the rough outer shell. It was not hollow. It was layered. Ethan eased the pressure and stepped back, breathing slowly. Inside the stone, partially encased, was a solid core of metal unlike anything he had seen in ordinary quarry samples. It was seamless, almost polished, with faint markings etched along its surface that did not appear random. They curved in deliberate arcs, intersecting at measured intervals, more like design than accident. Ranger lowered his head and stared into the opening, his expression steady and intent. He did not bark. He did not retreat. He simply watched, as if guarding something that had waited a very long time to be seen. Ethan felt the room grow quiet around them again, the owl outside silent now, the wind reduced to a distant whisper through pine needles. Whatever his father had carried home all those years ago had not been a mistake, and it had not been meaningless. It had been protected, and now, under the steady light of a single bulb in a modest shed at the edge of a pine grove, it was beginning to reveal why. The metal core did not gleam in a dramatic burst of light. It revealed itself quietly, like something accustomed to waiting. Ethan stood over the workbench with the pry bar still resting in his hands, his breath slow and measured as he studied the exposed interior. The outer stone shell had split just enough to uncover a section roughly 8 inches wide, and within that opening lay a smooth cylindrical surface unlike any natural formation he had ever handled. It was cool even beneath the shed lamp, its finish neither scratched nor corroded, as though time had chosen not to touch it. Ranger stepped closer, lowering his head until his nose hovered inches from the opening. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled in a soft, steady stream, his ears tilted forward with disciplined focus. Ethan eased the pry bar away and set it down carefully on the bench. He did not want to rush what felt deliberate. He ran his fingertips along the exposed metal, tracing the faint curved markings etched across it. They were not random scratches. Each line intersected with another at consistent intervals, forming a pattern that suggested intention. The arcs bent toward a central point deeper inside the stone, as though the core had been designed around something even further within. The shed felt smaller now, the air close and concentrated. Ethan reached for a shop cloth and wiped away loose dust from the seam. As he cleared more of the fracture, the opening widened by a fraction of an inch, enough to reveal that the metal cylinder extended through the entire center of the rock. It was not embedded like a fragment. It was housed there. Ranger suddenly stiffened. His tail lifted slightly, not high in alarm, but firm with awareness. He gave 2 soft taps of his paw against the bench, and then looked directly at Ethan, amber eyes bright and unwavering. Ethan understood the signal. The dog was not reacting to danger. He was reacting to change. Ethan leaned closer, bringing his ear near the opening. For a moment he heard nothing but his own breathing. Then, beneath that, almost imperceptible, there was a low vibration, steady and rhythmic, like distant machinery humming behind thick walls. It pulsed at even intervals, neither accelerating nor fading. He counted without thinking, the habit ingrained from years of training. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The pulse returned on the 6th count. Ranger tilted his head slightly, as though he too had found the rhythm. Ethan straightened slowly, his mind working through possibilities. This was not a simple mineral deposit. It was not a geode or a common or sample. It had weight beyond stone, structure beyond accident. He remembered the final weeks before his father's passing, the quiet evenings when they had sat on the back porch watching the sun sink behind the hills. His father had spoken sparingly, but once he had said, "Some discoveries are not meant for crowds. They are meant for the one who stays." At the time, Ethan had assumed it was another lesson about patience. Now the words felt more like instruction. He walked to the shed door and pushed it open, allowing the cool night air to drift inside. The stars above the pine grove shone clearly, undisturbed by city light, and the scent of earth seemed sharper somehow, as though the ground itself had shifted its attention. Ranger moved to the doorway as well, scanning the tree line before returning to the bench without hesitation. The dog did not appear unsettled. He appeared certain. Ethan returned to the workbench and examined the etched markings more closely. Along one curve he noticed something subtle, a sequence of shallow impressions spaced evenly, almost like coordinates or measurements. He brushed them clean and leaned in until the lamp's glow caught the detail. They resembled numbers, faint but precise, carved into the metal before it had ever been sealed within stone. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from realization. Whatever this was, it had been placed deliberately inside that rock, hidden beneath a rough exterior that discouraged curiosity. He rested his palm lightly against the metal core again. The vibration continued, patient and unwavering. Ranger sat beside him, posture calm but resolute, as if guarding a threshold that had only just been opened. In that modest shed at the edge of the woods, under the steady hum of a single bulb, Ethan understood something with quiet certainty. His father had not left him a relic. He had left him a responsibility. And whatever lay at the heart of that metal cylinder was waiting for the right hands to decide what came next. The vibration did not fade with the passing minutes. It continued in steady intervals, as dependable as a heartbeat measured beneath layers of stone and steel. Ethan remained beside the workbench long after the night had settled fully over the pine grove, the shed lamp casting a warm circle that held back the dark. Ranger lay down at first, front paws crossed neatly, but his eyes never closed. They stayed fixed on the narrow opening in the rock as though he understood that something inside it had shifted from hidden to awake. Ethan studied the etched markings again, tracing the shallow impressions that resembled numbers. They were arranged in a sequence along one arc of the metal cylinder, each character evenly spaced, precise, and intentional. He fetched a small notebook from the cabin and carefully copied the sequence down by hand, writing each number slowly to avoid error. The act felt ceremonial rather than analytical, like recording coordinates from a map that led somewhere far beyond geography. When he finished, he compared the pattern to common survey markings he had seen in his father's old field journals. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable. His father had often sketched grid lines and measurement arcs in the margins of those worn notebooks, always speaking about the land as if it were layered with stories waiting to be read. Ethan remembered one afternoon years earlier when his father had returned from a remote site near the old quarry, boots coated in red dust, eyes thoughtful but guarded. He had carried something heavy wrapped in canvas that day. Ethan had asked what he had found. His father had smiled faintly and said, "Something that does not belong in the wrong hands." At the time, Ethan had assumed it was simply rare ore. Now the memory pressed against him with new clarity. Ranger rose suddenly and walked around the workbench again, nose hovering inches above the split stone. He stopped at the opposite end of the cylinder and gave a single soft bark, then placed his paw against the wood as he had before. Ethan followed the indication and noticed another faint seam near the far edge, narrower and nearly invisible unless viewed from a certain angle. He adjusted the lamp slightly, letting the light strike the metal at a sharper degree. There, along the underside, another set of markings appeared, smaller but arranged in a circular formation around what looked like a recessed panel no wider than 2 inches across. It did not resemble a natural feature. It resembled access. Ethan's pulse steadied rather than quickened. Training had taught him that when something significant revealed itself, calm was more useful than excitement. He wiped his hands clean and leaned closer, examining the recessed area without touching it. The vibration seemed to concentrate there, faint but focused, like energy contained behind a barrier. Ranger lowered himself beside the bench again, but kept his head upright, ears forward, posture alert and patient. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pine branches, carrying the scent of cold earth into the shed. The world beyond remained ordinary and undisturbed, unaware of what rested on a simple wooden workbench under a single bulb. Ethan stepped back and considered his next move. He did not feel threatened. He felt entrusted. Whatever mechanism or material lay inside that metal core had been sealed deliberately within a common stone, disguised beneath rough edges and muted color so that only someone willing to look twice would ever question it. His father had not told the family about it. He had not displayed it as a trophy or boasted about its value. He had left it quietly to the one son who chose it without bargaining. Ethan reached out and rested his hand lightly over the recessed panel without applying pressure. The vibration aligned beneath his palm, steady and unwavering. Ranger's tail gave a single slow sweep across the shed floor, not in agitation but in quiet affirmation. Ethan drew a slow breath and understood something simple and profound. The stone had never been about possession. It had been about discernment. And whatever the cylinder was built to protect would only open for someone who valued it for more than what it could be sold for. The night deepened around the shed, yet inside that modest wooden structure the air felt charged with quiet anticipation. Ethan kept his hand hovering just above the recessed panel, not touching it, simply sensing the steady pulse that seemed to gather beneath the metal surface. The vibration had not changed in speed or strength, but it felt more defined now, as though the cylinder recognized attention. Ranger rose slowly from his resting position and stepped closer again, placing himself at Ethan's side with calm authority. His ears were forward, his breathing even, his amber eyes fixed not on Ethan but on the precise spot where the recessed circle met the curved arc of etched markings. Ethan withdrew his hand and studied the sequence he had written down in his notebook. The numbers aligned in a pattern that suggested coordinates, perhaps latitude and longitude, though one digit seemed deliberately altered. His father had been meticulous with measurements. If there was a deviation, it was intentional. Ethan walked back into the cabin and retrieved a small handheld compass along with his father's old survey map case, which he had kept stored in a cedar chest since the funeral. He returned to the shed and laid the worn leather case beside the rock, opening it carefully. Inside were folded maps marked with fine pencil lines, each grid annotated with dates and small notations in his father's steady handwriting. Ethan searched for any reference to unusual mineral deposits or restricted areas. Near the back of the case, tucked behind a folded topographic chart of the county quarry region, he found a smaller sheet labeled simply with the year from 2 decades earlier. Several points were circled in red ink, each connected by faint curved lines that mirrored the arcs etched into the cylinder. Ranger leaned forward and placed his nose against the edge of the map, then lifted his head and gave one soft bark, as if confirming the connection. Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle over him. The numbers on the cylinder were not random measurements. They corresponded to locations his father had surveyed personally. He compared the etched sequence to the coordinates on the map and realized that when adjusted by the altered digit, they pointed directly to an isolated ridge near the abandoned quarry site 20 miles north of the cabin. The pulse within the metal cylinder continued its steady rhythm as though in agreement. Ethan returned his attention to the recessed panel. He examined it more closely now, noticing a narrow indentation along its edge, subtle enough to escape casual observation. It resembled a pressure point rather than a keyhole. He hesitated only briefly before pressing his thumb gently against the indentation. For a moment nothing happened. Then the vibration shifted in tone, not louder, but clearer, like a note tuned into resonance. Ranger's posture sharpened instantly. He did not bark this time. He stood still, muscles poised yet composed, eyes reflecting the shed light with unwavering focus. A faint click sounded from within the cylinder, soft but distinct, followed by a slight mechanical adjustment beneath the metal surface. The recessed panel rotated a fraction of an inch, revealing a slim seam along its circumference. Ethan withdrew his thumb slowly and waited. The panel did not open fully, but the seam suggested that it would with further input. He felt no threat in the mechanism, only precision. His father had once told him that the greatest discoveries required both knowledge and character. This felt like a test of both. Ethan glanced at the map again, then at Ranger, who held his gaze steadily as if awaiting instruction. The dog's presence grounded him, reminding him that clarity often came not from urgency, but from alignment. The pulse inside the cylinder continued at its measured interval, patient and unwavering, as though prepared to wait another 20 years if necessary. Ethan closed the map case carefully and placed it beside the rock. He did not attempt to force the panel further. Instead, he rested his palm lightly over the metal and felt the vibrations settle beneath his skin. The coordinates pointed north. The mechanism responded to touch. The pattern mirrored his father's work. It was no longer a question of value. It was a question of purpose. And as Ranger stepped back and sat beside him with quiet assurance, Ethan understood that whatever lay sealed within that cylinder was not meant to remain in the shed. It was meant to lead them somewhere only the patient would follow. The decision did not feel dramatic, only clear. Ethan closed the shed door gently and stood for a moment in the cool night air, looking north beyond the tree line where the land rose into darkened ridges. 20 miles was not far by distance, yet it felt like a boundary between what had been hidden and what was about to unfold. Ranger stood beside him, posture steady, gaze fixed in the same direction as if he too sensed that the coordinates were more than numbers on a page. Ethan returned inside and carefully wrapped the split stone and exposed cylinder in thick canvas, securing it with rope so that nothing shifted during travel. He did not attempt to remove the metal core from its shell. It felt wrong to separate what had been sealed together with such intention. He carried the bundle to the truck bed and fastened it securely, checking each knot twice. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat without instruction, settling into position with focused calm. The engine turned over with a low rumble, and the headlights cut two pale beams through the pine trunks as they rolled out onto the gravel road. The night carried a faint silver glow from a waxing moon, illuminating the edges of the forest in quiet contrast. Ethan drove steadily, following the county highway north before turning onto an older service road that had not been repaved in years. The terrain shifted gradually, from flat farmland to rising slopes scattered with rock outcroppings and scrub brush. Ranger remained alert but composed, occasionally lifting his nose toward the air as though measuring changes in scent carried through the cracked window. After 30 minutes, the asphalt gave way entirely to packed dirt, and the road narrowed to a single lane winding toward the abandoned quarry ridge. Ethan remembered coming here once as a teenager when his father had brought him along on a survey trip. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than a forgotten excavation site, quiet and empty. Now, guided by coordinates etched in metal and preserved within stone, it felt different, purposeful. He parked near the base of the ridge where the service road ended and cut the engine. The silence that followed was complete, interrupted only by a distant breeze moving across dry grass. He stepped out and retrieved the wrapped stone from the truck bed, carrying it carefully toward the rise. Ranger moved ahead this time, not running, not pulling, but walking with measured intent, his body angled slightly uphill. The moonlight revealed a faint path carved into the earth long ago by heavy machinery, now softened by years of neglect. As they climbed, Ethan felt the weight of the bundle steady in his arms, neither cumbersome nor burdensome, simply significant. When they reached the top of the ridge, the landscape opened before them into a broad clearing where the quarry pit lay dormant, its edges smoothed by time and weather. Ranger stopped abruptly near a flat section of exposed bedrock and lowered his head. He circled once, then twice, before planting his paws firmly and giving a single deliberate bark. Ethan set the bundle down on the rock surface and knelt beside him. He pulled the notebook from his pocket and compared the coordinates again, adjusting for the altered digit his father had embedded in the sequence. The corrected position aligned almost perfectly with the center of the clearing where Ranger now stood. Ethan placed his palm against the wrapped stone, feeling through the canvas for the faint vibration within. The pulse continued, steady as before, but as he held it there, the rhythm shifted subtly, as if responding to proximity. Ranger's ears lifted sharply, and he stepped back half a pace, eyes locked on the ground beneath them. Ethan removed the canvas slowly, revealing the fractured stone and exposed metal core under the moonlight. The recessed panel faced upward, faint seam visible along its edge. He pressed his thumb gently against the indentation once more. This time, the vibration resonated outward, not louder, but deeper, traveling through the bedrock beneath his knees. A soft mechanical release sounded from within the cylinder, and the panel rotated further than before, opening to reveal a narrow slot illuminated by a faint internal glow. Ethan stared at it in quiet awe, not because it was bright or dramatic, but because it was unmistakably alive with purpose. Ranger stood still beside him, tail steady, breath even, as though guarding a doorway long concealed. Under the open sky at the forgotten quarry ridge, Ethan understood that the coordinates had not led him to treasure buried beneath the earth. They had led him to the place where what was hidden was meant to awaken. The circular section of bedrock rose slowly, no more than 2 inches at first, as though testing the night air after years of concealment. A thin seam widened into a clear boundary, revealing the edge of a hatch no larger than 3 feet across. Ethan stepped back instinctively, not in fear, but in respect for the precision unfolding beneath him. Ranger stood firm at his side, shoulders squared, ears forward, gaze fixed on the center of the circle. The faint blue glow from the cylinder reflected softly across the exposed stone, outlining the hatch with quiet clarity. Ethan crouched again and placed both hands beneath the lifted edge. The material felt smooth and engineered, not like ordinary quarry rock. With steady pressure, he raised the hatch fully. It opened without resistance, balanced as if counterweight from below. A cool breath of air drifted upward from the darkness beneath, carrying a faint metallic scent untouched by weather. Inside the opening, a narrow stairwell descended into shadow, carved with geometric precision rather than rough excavation. The steps were reinforced with the same smooth metal as the cylinder core, their surfaces free of rust or decay. Ethan retrieved a small flashlight from his jacket pocket and aimed the beam downward. The light revealed a chamber approximately 10 feet below the surface, circular in shape, walls lined with panels that appeared both mechanical and deliberate in design. Ranger moved closer to the edge of the opening, lowering his head to peer into the space. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled in calm assurance, his tail steady and level. Ethan understood the signal. There was no threat waiting below, only mystery. He secured the cylinder in the truck bed once more, leaving the fractured stone shell wrapped in canvas, then returned to the hatch. With one final glance at the moonlit ridge above, he began his descent, boots contacting each metal step with quiet certainty. Ranger followed directly behind, paws landing with careful balance. The air inside the chamber was cooler, but not damp. It felt preserved rather than abandoned. When Ethan reached the bottom, he turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the curved walls. Embedded within the panels were subtle lines of light similar to the glow from the cylinder, forming arcs that converged toward a central platform. The platform stood waist-high and supported a sealed container crafted from the same seamless metal. It was not large, perhaps 2 feet long, but its presence filled the room with purpose. Ethan approached the platform slowly. Ranger circled once around the chamber's perimeter, sniffing along the edges before returning to Ethan's side. The container bore the same engraved symbol he had seen on the slender metal piece. Along its top surface ran a narrow slot shaped precisely to match the beveled key he carried in his pocket. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him. Not heavy, but meaningful. His father had not hidden wealth beneath this ridge. He had hidden knowledge. Ethan withdrew the metal piece and held it over the slot, aligning the beveled edges carefully. The chamber seemed to grow quieter as he lowered it into place. The fit was exact. A soft mechanical tone sounded, followed by a gentle shift in the lines of light along the walls. The container responded by unlocking with a subtle release. The top panel lifted upward on concealed hinges, revealing its contents under a soft internal glow. Inside lay a collection of documents sealed in protective casing, along with several compact data drives and a small leather journal bearing his father's initials embossed on the cover. Ethan's breath caught for a moment, not from shock, but from recognition. This was not treasure measured in currency. It was research, designs, and recorded discoveries preserved for the right hands. Ranger sat beside him, posture composed, as if acknowledging the significance of what had been revealed. Ethan reached out and lifted the leather journal carefully. The pages inside were filled with detailed diagrams, survey maps, and handwritten notes describing a rare mineral deposit capable of revolutionizing clean energy storage if developed responsibly. His father had documented everything, including the decision to conceal the discovery until someone he trusted could protect it from exploitation. Ethan closed the journal gently and looked around the chamber once more. Beneath the silent ridge and open sky, he understood fully. The stone had never been about proving his worth to his family. It had been about proving his character to himself. And now, standing in a hidden chamber crafted with patience and foresight, he realized that the greatest inheritance is not what changes your bank account, but what changes the future you choose to build. The chamber did not feel like a vault built for secrecy alone. It felt like a place built for discernment. Ethan stood quietly before the open container, the leather journal resting in his hands, the faint internal glow tracing the edges of the metal walls in soft arcs of blue. Ranger remained seated at his side, posture composed and steady, his presence grounding the moment in something solid and familiar. Ethan turned the journal over once more, brushing his thumb across his father's initials. The leather was worn but carefully preserved, as though it had been handled with reverence rather than urgency. He opened to the first marked section and read slowly under the beam of his flashlight. The entries were dated across several years, detailing the discovery of a rare mineral composite embedded deep within the northern ridge. It was not gold, not silver, not anything traditionally chased by prospectors. It was a compound with extraordinary conductivity and storage capacity, capable of holding energy at levels far beyond conventional lithium systems, without the environmental damage common to current extraction methods. Ethan felt his breath steady as he absorbed the implications. The notes described small-scale tests performed discreetly in a private workshop, the results consistent and promising. His father had written not about profit margins, but about responsibility. He had underlined a single sentence in careful script. Innovation without conscience becomes exploitation. Ethan closed the journal briefly, letting the weight of that sentence settle. The data drives within the container were labeled methodically, each marked with dates and subject headings that corresponded to the diagrams. In the journal, Ranger shifted slightly and rose to his feet, walking once around the chamber's perimeter before returning to Ethan's side. The dog's movement was calm, not restless, as though confirming that the space held no hidden danger. Ethan knelt and lifted one of the sealed document cases. Inside were detailed blueprints outlining a modular energy storage system designed to power rural communities independently from unstable grids. The scale of it was ambitious but grounded in practicality. His father had not dreamed recklessly. He had calculated carefully. The chamber lights pulsed faintly along the curved walls, synchronized with the soft resonance still emanating from the open mechanism above. Ethan realized that the cylinder and hatch were not merely security features. They were safeguards against haste. Only someone who followed the sequence patiently, who valued the stone for more than its appearance, could access what lay beneath. He imagined how easily this discovery could have been misused in the wrong hands, stripped for quick profit, stripped of its deeper purpose. He thought of his siblings, of the argument in the living room, of how quickly they had dismissed the rock without question. He felt no anger now, only clarity. Ranger sat down again, amber eyes fixed on Ethan's face as if reading the decision forming there. Ethan placed the journal carefully back into the container, but kept one document in hand. It was a summary proposal addressed not to investors, but to future partners who shared the same ethical commitment. His father had written, "The right time is when the right steward appears." Ethan looked around the chamber once more, absorbing its quiet precision. This was not an inheritance meant to isolate him. It was an inheritance meant to empower him to choose wisely. He closed the container gently, the mechanism responding with a soft, respectful click. The internal glow dimmed to a resting state, and the chamber lights settled into a low, steady line along the walls. Ranger rose as Ethan turned toward the staircase. Together they ascended slowly, leaving the chamber intact beneath the ridge. When Ethan reached the surface, the moon still hung above the quarry, silver and unwavering. The hatch lowered seamlessly behind them, merging with the bedrock until the seam disappeared entirely. He stood for a long moment beneath the open sky, the cool air steady against his face. The stone, the cylinder, the chamber. All of it had led to this understanding. Wealth could be counted. Purpose had to be chosen. And as Ranger stood beside him, gaze fixed northward toward the quiet horizon, Ethan knew that the true measure of what he had found would not be decided by market value, but by the future he chose to protect. By the time Ethan and Ranger returned to the cabin, the eastern horizon was already softening with the faintest hint of morning gray. The drive back from the ridge had been quiet, the dirt road stretching behind them like a closed chapter rather than an escape. Ethan parked beside the shed but did not unload the fractured stone immediately. He sat in the truck for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the sky lighten through the pine branches. Ranger remained seated beside him, calm and steady, his breathing slow and even as if the night's discovery had settled into him as naturally as sleep. Ethan stepped out and carried the wrapped stone back into the shed, placing it carefully on the workbench exactly where it had rested before. The outer shell still looked ordinary under the dim bulb, rough and unremarkable, giving no hint of what had awakened beneath the ridge. He covered it again with canvas, not to hide it, but to protect it from casual eyes. Inside the cabin, he set the leather journal on the kitchen table and brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar scent grounding him in something simple and human. As the first light filtered through the window, he opened the journal once more and read deeper into his father's entries. The later pages described careful conversations with a small circle of engineers and environmental scientists, people who had agreed that the discovery must be handled responsibly. There were notes about forming a foundation rather than a corporation, about partnering with rural cooperatives rather than major investors. Ethan paused over one passage written in firmer ink than the rest. If this ever becomes public, it must begin with trust, not competition. Ranger lay near the table, chin resting on his paws, eyes following Ethan's movements with quiet awareness. The dog's presence felt less like companionship and more like confirmation. Ethan closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, staring at the morning light spilling across the wooden floor. He understood now why his father had never spoken openly about the rock. The temptation to monetize such a discovery would have been overwhelming. The pressure would have fractured relationships, drawn attention from those who saw only profit in rare resources. A soft vibration buzzed from Ethan's cell phone on the counter. He glanced at the screen and saw his brother's name. The message was brief but pointed, asking whether Ethan had reconsidered selling the rock to a collector who had expressed interest after hearing rumors. Ethan set the phone down without responding. There was no anger in him, only clarity. Ranger lifted his head slightly, ears tilting toward the sound of the device before relaxing again. Ethan rose and walked to the window, looking out at the pine grove beyond the yard. The land felt unchanged, the world outside unaware of what had shifted overnight. He thought of the chamber beneath the ridge, sealed once more beneath engineered stone, waiting patiently. He thought of the modular energy system sketched in careful lines across his father's pages, designed to power small towns without draining the earth. This was not a discovery meant to be auctioned. It was a responsibility meant to be stewarded. Ethan returned to the table and opened his laptop. He began drafting a message to one of the engineers mentioned in the journal, a man his father had trusted years ago. He wrote slowly, explaining that he had found the materials and wished to continue the work under the same guiding principle of ethical development. Ranger stood and walked to his side, resting his head lightly against Ethan's leg. The gesture was simple, steady, and full of quiet assurance. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head and felt the warmth beneath his palm. Outside, the sun cleared the horizon fully, sending golden light across the clearing and through the cabin windows. In that steady morning glow, Ethan understood that the real shock was not what had been hidden in stone, but what had been hidden in character. The rock had revealed more than a chamber. It had revealed the measure of the man willing to carry it without knowing its worth. The reply from his father's former colleague arrived 2 days later, not as a dramatic declaration, but as a measured email written in careful language. Ethan read it at the kitchen table while morning rain tapped softly against the cabin windows. Ranger lay stretched across the doorway, watching the gray sky as though listening to something beyond the sound of falling water. The engineer, a man named Dr. Harold Whitaker, confirmed that he had long suspected Ethan might one day reach out. He wrote that Ethan's father had shared enough to establish trust, but never enough to expose the full design. He had waited for the right moment and the right steward. The message ended with a single line that lingered in Ethan's mind. If you are ready to protect it, I am ready to help build it. Ethan closed the laptop slowly and looked toward the shed where the stone rested beneath canvas. The world outside the cabin felt unchanged. Trucks still passed along the county highway. Neighbors still tended their fields. Nothing in the morning air suggested that beneath a quiet ridge lay a discovery capable of reshaping energy systems for entire communities. Ranger rose and walked to Ethan's side, resting his chin briefly on the edge of the table before lifting his gaze. The dog's amber eyes carried that steady awareness that had guided them from the first vibration in the shed to the hidden chamber beneath the quarry. Ethan understood that the next step required more than secrecy. It required structure. He spent the afternoon reviewing the journal again, outlining a plan to establish a small foundation in his father's name, one dedicated not to profit margins, but to sustainable development. He drafted legal language that prioritized community ownership and environmental safeguards. The work felt deliberate and calm, not rushed. By late afternoon, another message appeared on his phone, this time from his sister. She had heard rumors through a mutual acquaintance that a geological consultant had been seen near the old quarry road. Her tone was cautious but curious, asking whether there was more to the rock than Ethan had admitted. He read the message without irritation. He knew that curiosity often followed dismissal once opportunity became visible. He responded simply that he was working on something important and would explain when the time was right. He did not accuse. He did not reveal. He chose patience over reaction. Ranger stepped outside as the rain eased, standing on the porch with his ears angled toward the treeling. Ethan joined him, breathing in the scent of wet pine and fresh earth. The sky had begun to clear, pale light breaking through the clouds in thin bands. He thought about how easily this path could have unfolded differently. He could have sold the stone to the first collector who offered cash. He could have announced the discovery publicly and invited competition before establishing safeguards. Instead, he had followed the rhythm that had guided him from the first faint vibration to the chamber beneath the ridge. It was not instinct alone. It was trust shaped by memory and discipline. Ranger turned his head slightly and gave one quiet bark, as if affirming the direction rather than questioning it. Ethan placed his hand on the dog's back and felt the steady rise and fall of breath beneath thick fur. He realized that the greatest shock would not come from the value of the mineral or the scale of the innovation. It would come from the restraint with which it was introduced. In a world accustomed to rapid announcements and immediate gains, the quiet choice to build slowly would be the unexpected part. As evening settled over the cabin once more, Ethan finalized his message to Dr. Whitaker and scheduled a private meeting for the following week. The stone remained in the shed, silent now, its purpose no longer hidden but not yet revealed to the world. Under the clearing sky, with Ranger standing watch beside him, Ethan understood that inheritance is not measured by what you uncover, but by how carefully you carry it forward. The meeting with Dr. Whitaker took place 1 week later in a modest office overlooking a quiet stretch of farmland 40 miles south of the cabin. Ethan arrived early, Ranger seated upright in the passenger seat, as always, watching the gravel lot with calm alertness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fields, and the air carried the clean scent of harvested earth. Ethan carried the leather journal and a single sealed document case beneath his arm, not the entire collection, only enough to confirm continuity. When Dr. Whitaker stepped forward to greet him, his expression held neither surprise nor greed, only measured respect. The conversation that followed was deliberate and steady. They reviewed the diagrams, the conductivity results, the projected capacity of the mineral composite. Whitaker confirmed what Ethan already sensed. Properly developed, the system could provide stable, renewable storage for small towns across the region, reducing dependence on aging infrastructure and volatile markets. Yet both men agreed that the foundation must be established first, structured with transparency and oversight. No public announcement would be made until safeguards were secured. When Ethan returned to the cabin that evening, the sky burned with the soft amber glow of late autumn sunset. Ranger leaped lightly from the truck and trotted ahead toward the porch, tail steady, as if welcoming them back to something unchanged and dependable. Ethan paused before entering the shed, resting his hand briefly on the weathered door. Inside, the wrapped stone remained where he had left it, silent and unassuming under the dim bulb. He did not uncover it. He did not need to. Its purpose had already shifted from revelation to responsibility. Over the next several weeks, the foundation documents were filed, reviewed, and quietly approved. Partnerships formed carefully, not with corporations seeking control, but with cooperatives committed to shared benefit. The first pilot system was designed to power a rural school district 30 miles north of the Quarry Ridge, a place where winter outages had once disrupted classrooms for days at a time. When the prototype was finally installed months later, Ethan stood beside the modest building as the system activated. The lights inside the school flickered once, then stabilized with a steady, reliable glow. Teachers and students did not cheer loudly. They simply smiled in relief, unaware of the hidden chamber beneath the ridge or the fractured stone that had guarded the path. Ranger sat at Ethan's side, watching the quiet scene unfold, ears forward, posture proud but composed. Word of the innovation spread gradually, not through sensational headlines, but through communities sharing their experience of stability and independence. Eventually, Ethan's siblings heard the full story. They arrived at the cabin one afternoon, expressions softened by understanding rather than accusation. Ethan welcomed them onto the porch without bitterness. He did not recount the chamber in dramatic detail. He spoke instead about their father's intention, about stewardship over spectacle. The conversation was not perfect, but it was honest. As dusk settled over the pine grove, Ethan and Ranger sat side by side on the porch steps, watching the last light fade beyond the trees. The world had not transformed overnight. There were still challenges ahead, negotiations to navigate, responsibilities to uphold. His leg, breathing slow and steady. Ethan looked toward the north where the Quarry Ridge rested unseen beyond the darkening forest. The stone had once been dismissed as worthless, carried away by the one willing to keep it without knowing its value. Now its true inheritance was measured not in dollars, but in light shining steadily through school windows on cold winter mornings. In the quiet that followed, Ethan understood that the greatest discoveries do not shout their worth. They wait patiently for the one who listens long enough to hear what truly matters.